Well, hello everyone, and welcome to my January book reviews. I read 13 books this month, which is probably the most I've ever read in a month. Some of these were shorter, but one of them was 1,300 pages, so I think it averaged out to about just 13 solid books this month. These videos don't get as many views as the other ones, but I do appreciate all of you that are here, so thanks for watching. I will group these by genre, so if you want to go to the timestamp below, if you want to skip to a certain genre or skip over a certain genre that you don't read, I won't be offended. And at the very end, I'll give you a TBR of 3 things that I plan on reading next month. And I'm really excited about the 3 that I'm going to show you. I always put my book of the month last, but this month I'm going to put it next to last. There's a nonfiction book that I'll put last that kind of relates to that book of the month. So a little out of order from what I normally do, but if you watch on for that, I think you'll be very pleased to see what my book of the month is. I'm really excited to talk about it. So let's go ahead and get started. The first category I have is crime fiction. I have 3 things that I read in that category. 2 of them I read on my Kindle, and these were 2 books by Spencer Quinn, Sense and Sensibility and Heart of Barkness, which are in the Chet and Bernie mystery series. Now, if you wonder why they have those comical titles, it's because Chet and Bernie are a pair of detectives, but Chet is a dog. And Chet is also the narrator. And I don't know if I've ever read any books that made me laugh out loud as much as these books do, because Chet, if you've ever had a dog or love dogs, Spencer Quinn just does the personification perfectly, and he's such a delight to follow as a narrator, because he goes on tangents just like, typical dogs do when their attention span goes different directions. But beyond just a great narrator, these are really well plotted mysteries. They're not, the best in the business, but they're all really very solid and pretty consistent. And these were the, I think, 8th and 9th books in the Chet and Bernie mystery series that Spencer Quinn is writing, and he keeps just cranking them out because they're just delightful, and I know there's a lot of followers of this series. So I enjoyed them quite a bit. I gave Sense and Sensibility 4 stars, and I gave Heart of Barkness 3.5 stars. Okay, the third book in my crime fiction category is The Dark Hours by Michael Connelly. I wrote a review, pretty detailed review on my Goodreads profile. I'll put that down here. It was kind of a bunch of word vomit, and then I read back at it, and I think it's one of the better reviews I've written on that platform. So if you want a more in-depth review about this book, go check me out on Goodreads. I'd love to interact with you there. The thing that made this greater than a lot of other Michael Connelly novels was actually kind of the C story, which was the subtext going on in the background of this story. The A story is a murder that happens at New Year's Eve that Renee Ballard, our hero, is trying to solve, and it gets connected with a cold case of Harry Bosch, so Harry, who's retired, gets to be part of the story as well. And then the B story is another great one, trying to track down a pair of serial rapists. 2 very gritty crime stories. But for me, the subtext, the real world C story is what made this great. Renee Ballard is a great detective, and it's kind of hard to be a cop right now with defund the police and protest and trying to be a cop during a pandemic. And Connelly embraces all of that. And Ballard's a cop that knows that police reform is needed, but doesn't see how it's possible, and doesn't think that because of the systemic things in place that it's possible to change the police force, despite Bosch saying the only way that you can produce systemic changes from within. So we find Ballard questioning whether she wants to continue her job. And at the very end of the book, you're left wondering if she's going to be Detective Renee Ballard from the LAPD in the next book, or private investigator, or doing something else in the next book. So that was fascinating for me. And it was just in the background, but for me, it just added gritty realism to the story. Connelly always showcases that as well as anybody. In fact, if you watch the show Bosch, that's what I really liked about the show Bosch. They did not try to sensationalize it. They didn't go for, over-the-top, shocking things to get people to talk about the show. They just made it gritty, they made it real, and I think that was one of the strengths of the show, and one of the strengths of Connelly's books, is including The Dark Hours. Dark Hours, 5 out of 5. Fantastic book by Connelly, and I can't wait to pre-order the next one, which is out in November, I think. Okay, so from crime fiction, going to fantasy next. I read 6 things in the fantasy genre. 5 of them were Chronicles of Prydain by Lloyd Alexander. This is a 5-book series that I read, got them upside down, that I read as a youth. And if you saw my video where I talked about the 10-book series I wanted to read in 2022, this was number 1, so I'm right on target with that list. This was the first book series I ever read in middle school. And I had been a big mystery reader before that, and this was the first time I read something in the fantasy genre. And I remember going in very distinctly, even though it's a long time ago, going into the library and seeing it wasn't this cover exactly, but it was the traditional cover, and it has the Horned King on the front. And I saw that, and it just fueled my imagination, and I devoured this series very quickly, much like I did last month. They're not very big books. You know, most of them are around 200 pages. So some of these I put down in one reading, and most of them only took 2 days. It's a children's series. And the first 2 books were very much along that vein. So even though I was, filled with nostalgia at seeing Taryn, the assistant pig keeper at Caer Dallben, and Dallben the enchanter, and the Princess Elanwi of the red gold hair, and Faithful Gurgi with his crunchings and munchings, and Fluter Flom the bard, who's this outlandish, buffoonish, cartoonish character. I loved seeing all of them. So, the first 2 books, some nostalgia, I give them 3 out of 5. They are children's books. But I thought in the 3rd book, which is The Castle of Lear, that it got a little bit darker, and it elevated the story quite a bit. It just made the stakes a lot higher in my mind because of how dark the conclusion of the 3rd book was. The Castle of Lear I gave 4 out of 5. Taran Wanderer, which is the 4th book in the series, in my mind was the best one. Most of these books, because again, they're children's books, are very plot-oriented. But in the 4th book, the last half of the 4th book, Alexander slows it down, gets rid of most of the characters, and just focuses on Taran and works on his character development. As an adult reading these books, I found Taran so annoying in the early books. He's just this impetuous youth that I'm sure I loved when I was an impetuous youth, but as an adult, he just drove me crazy. Well, in the 4th book, he grows up. He goes from being this annoying kid to a pretty mature young man in this book, and I was so thankful that Alexander did that, and I didn't have 5 books that were very similar. I gave Taran Wanderer 4.5 out of 5. I gave The High King the same score, although I think Taran Wanderer was a little bit better. What I liked about The High King is he didn't go with the easy ending. I really enjoyed the ending. In fact, in either his foreword or his epilogue, he talked about how a lot of people didn't like the ending, and he hoped that I did. And I wonder what my 6th grade self thought about the ending, because I thought it was very fantastic. This is a series that, much like the Harry Potter books that start as a children's series and then end as an adult series, but I think this one actually has a better ending than that one. But I really enjoyed this series. I gave Chronicles of Prydain a 4 out of 5. And the last work of fantasy I read this month was actually the first book of 2022, and that is Sharp Ends by Joe Abercrombie. This is a collection of short stories set in the world of the First Law. And full disclosure, I don't read a lot of short fiction. It doesn't really interest me as much as longer fiction does. I love the epic length books. I love novels. Short stories don't do much for me, but I have to say, with exception of maybe Raymond Carver, I don't know if I've read a better collection of short stories than Sharp Ends. I was very impressed with how Abercrombie is great at character even in the short form. I'd only read the 6 novels where you get time to develop all the characters, but I was really impressed. There are 3 stories in here where you're introduced to some new characters. And when you read the first story, you don't realize that there's going to be 3 stories with them. And in the first story, immediately, there were 3 just so vivid characters in here that I was just in love with. And I finished the story thinking, oh man, I wish I could get more of them. And then thankfully, later in the collection, we get to see them at 3 different times. It just shows how good Joe is at character. The other thing I really enjoyed about this was seeing characters of the First Law, but at different times. Most notably, there's a story about Logan Ninefingers in here that is before the First Law. And having seen where Logan's story takes him at the end of Red Country, you have two totally different people. And I found it fascinating to really see for the first time why Logan Ninefingers is really known as the Bloody Nine. Fantastic collection. 5 out of 5. All right, next genre, short stories. Just talk about some in the fantasy series, in the fantasy books if you skip through that one. But the first collection of short stories I have here is by my favorite author, Stephen King, Bazaar of Bad Dreams. This, much like the Abercrombie that I talked about just in the previous section, I'm most impressed with how King can create character so quickly. Because some of these short stories are really short, and I found myself loving these characters, and then all of a sudden, the story's over. The other thing I really liked with this is that he gave a little, paragraph or page or two about what gave him the idea for each story. And I find that fascinating, especially for someone like Stephen King, who is so diverse in his writing. One of those, I remember James Lipton asking Robin Williams, what goes on in your head? That's kind of what I feel like with Stephen King, because where do his ideas come from? So I love that every story in this book, he gives you the genesis of what started the story for him. I found that fascinating. But like most short story collections for me, kind of uneven. There are a couple in here that I didn't really care for. There are a couple I'd read already. I'd read on my Kindle, and Blockade Billy I had read as a standalone as well. So there were a couple that were kind of, I think just for the first time put in hardcover like this. But overall, pretty solid collection of short stories by King. I gave Bazaar of Bad Dreams 4 out of 5. The other short story collection is also by King, and it's If It Bleeds. And this it's advertised as 4 novellas, and I guess I can talk about it that way, although 2 of them are kind of short, and then one of them is more of a novelette length. It's about 200 pages, so 4 novellas in here. And there's one I flat out didn't like. It's a kind of a 3-act play, and it is told backwards, and I felt that every act got a little less interesting. My favorite was the first one. I forget the guy's name. Harrigan. First one's called Mr. Harrigan's Phone. And King came up with the idea of thinking about, what if you were at the cemetery and you heard a cell phone ring in a coffin? And that really doesn't tell the story of what it's about, but that was my favorite in this collection. The long one in this collection is the title, If It Bleeds, and it follows Holly Gibney, who was in the Bill Hodges trilogy, as well as The Outsider. And it was fun to revisit her, as well as a couple characters from the original trilogy. But I have to say that the story as a whole, it wasn't one of those things that I felt was necessary. So it wasn't one of those things I felt compelled, like, oh, this is something I need to do. It kind of just rehashed some of the things from The Outsider. So it didn't do a whole lot for me. Overall, If It Bleeds, with 4 novellas, 1 I didn't like and 1 I was kind of lukewarm on, I give it a 3.5 out of 5. All right, next to last, historical fiction. I had 1 work of historical fiction, which is also my book of the month, and that is Shogun by James Clavell. This was so impressive a read. Epic length historical fiction, about 1,300 pages, close to 1,400 pages. And it flew by because it's just such a compelling narrative. This was my book of the month. You'll see why I put this here and not last when I talk about my nonfiction pick after this. But I don't want to talk more about this because my next video, I'm going to do a full review on this book because it deserves it. It is frankly one of the best works I read. I will just say what I said on my Twitter when I did my short review on Twitter. I said, I finished this on January 16th. And it may be my best book of the year. So I really feel that this was so fantastic. But if you like historical fiction of epic length and you haven't read Shogun, so good. And how about this beautiful leather version I received as a gift? So awesome. Okay, my last book is nonfiction, and it's related to Shogun, and that's why I couldn't talk about this first. It would have been weird, but this is called Learning from Shogun, Japanese History and Western Fantasy, and the editor is Henry Smith, who is a professor, at least when this was published, which was early to mid 80s, professor at UC Santa Barbara. And it's a collection of essays written by historians and college professors with tie-ins to Clavel's book, which was so popular. It spawned a movie and a mini-series and all of those things. And like any work written by a bunch of historians and professors, some of them were pretty dry reads, but the ones that were more the topics of the things that I found most compelling about Shogun, like the cross-cultural connections, I found very riveting and very interesting. And I was also pleased to know that pretty much every essay, they were very complimentary to the book itself. It wasn't a, you know, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is horrible. But, you know, these things were fictionalized, this was changed, but it was still very well portrayed. So that's always nice to know, and especially when you fall in love with a new book, to find out that, you know, people who are experts in ancient Japan found it pretty accurate. So I gave Learning from Shogun a 3 out of 5. All right, so that's the 13 books I read this month. Let me give you 3 more that I'm going to read next month. Starting with, of course, Ender's Game. Doing a read-along on my channel. So you can still get on board with this if you can read this in the next 2 weeks, which you can. It's only 300 pages, which, and it goes by very quick because it's a very compelling read. I am doing one of these a month the entire year. I hope that some of you are joining me, but I hope that a lot of you are just joining me at least for this first one. Ender's Game, classic science fiction tale, some fantastic themes in here. This is often taught in schools. It's handed out at military academies, and it's just a very, 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 very great book. You can look for my review the last week of February, I will drop the review for Ender's Game. So I hope some of you are reading it. I look forward to talking to you about it. All right, another one that I will be reading. I'm actually going to start this one as soon as I turn off the camera here, and that is Fool's Errand by Robin Hobb. This is the first book in the Tawny Man trilogy. I fell in love with Robin Hobb as an author last year, having read both the Farseer trilogy and the Live Ship Traders trilogy. This is the third of the 5 series that tie in and make up the Realm of the Elderlings, and I'm so excited to be reunited with Fitz, who is the main character of the Farseer trilogy. And Fool's Errand is one I can't wait to start reading, so I need to finish up this video. So my last one on the TBR this month that I'm going to at least talk about here is Sacred by Dennis Lehane. Lehane tells gritty detective stories set in Boston, and this is one of the Kenzie and Gennaro books. There are 6 of those, and I'm really looking forward to reading Lehane. It's been far too long. I haven't read him for about 2 years, so it's time to get back to reading some Lehane, because I do love Dennis Lehane as an author. And that is my short TBR, some things that I'm going to be reading next month. So for that and more, please like and subscribe if you haven't already. Follow me on Twitter and Goodreads for more content. As always, thank you for watching, especially these book review videos, these monthly wrap-ups, because most people don't watch these ones. But thank you for being here. I do appreciate you. Thanks for watching. Until next time, goodbye.